Detective James Holloway arrived at the Langley estate just after midnight, the air thick with the scent of cigar smoke and something metallic, blood. The towering mansion loomed under the dim glow of the moon, its grandeur now tainted by the crime that had unfolded within its walls. A uniformed officer led him through the marble-floored hallway, past the grieving widow, Margaret Langley, who sat on a velvet settee with a blank stare, her hands trembling around a silk handkerchief. James offered her a brief nod before stepping into the study. Arthur Langley's body was slumped over his mahogany desk, a deep stab wound in his chest. The scene was eerily still. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no forced entry. The door had been locked from the inside, and the only other presence in the room was a large green parrot perched in a gilded cage near the window. As James scanned the room for evidence, a sudden voice broke the silence. "No, stop! Please!" James turned sharply toward the parrot. The voice was strained, desperate, eerily human. The officers in the room exchanged glances. "No, stop! Please!" the bird repeated, its head tilting as if amused by its own performance. James narrowed his eyes. The only witness to the murder was a parrot, and it had just given them their first clue. Detective James Holloway stood in the dimly lit study, his gaze shifting between the lifeless body of Arthur Langley and the parrot perched in its gilded cage. The crime scene offered little: no forced entry, no signs of struggle, and no apparent weapon left behind. The door had been locked from the inside, a puzzle that only deepened the mystery. As forensic specialists worked quietly, James stepped back into the hallway where Arthur's wife, Margaret, and his son, Daniel, waited alongside Arthur's longtime business partner, Leonard Crane, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Porter. Their faces were tight with grief, or something else. "Mr. Langley kept this room locked at all times?" James asked, eyes shifting to Margaret. "Always," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "He was private about his work. The only way in was with his key. It should still be in his pocket." James glanced at the forensic team. One of them nodded, confirming that the key was indeed found on the body. That meant one of two things. Arthur had let the killer in himself, or the murderer had been inside the house all along. "Did he have any enemies?" James continued. Margaret shook her head. "Not that I know of." Leonard sighed. "Arthur was ruthless in business, but murder? No, this doesn't make sense." James studied their expressions, searching for any flicker of deception. Before he could press further, a voice interrupted him. "You don't deserve this." Everyone turned toward the study. The parrot Charlie shifted on its perch, eyes glinting as it repeated the phrase again. "You don't deserve this." A chill ran down James's spine. The first phrase, "No, stop! Please," sounded like a cry for help. But this? It sounded like something the killer had said. Margaret covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Daniel looked pale. Leonard muttered, "What the hell?" under his breath. James turned back toward the study, staring at the parrot as it cocked its head. Had this bird just repeated the killer's words? Detective James Holloway took a deep breath before stepping into the Langley estate's sitting room, where the four key players in this twisted drama awaited him. Each had a potential motive, but so far, none had solid evidence tying them to the crime. It was time to start digging. He turned to the son first, Daniel Langley, the estranged son. Daniel sat slouched in an armchair, arms crossed, eyes cold. He hadn't shed a single tear. "You were estranged from your father," James stated. "Why?" Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Arthur Langley was a control freak. He cut me off years ago because I refused to take over the family business. He told me if I wanted money, I'd have to earn it like a real man." "But now you inherit everything," James pointed out. "That's quite the financial turnaround." Daniel rolled his eyes. "And you think I'd murder him for it? I wasn't even here when it happened. I was at a bar downtown. We'll be checking on that." Margaret Langley, the young wife. Next, James turned to Margaret, Arthur's much younger wife. She dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, her grief more composed now. "Mrs. Langley, where were you tonight?" "I was upstairs in bed," she said, voice trembling. "I took a sleeping pill around 10. I didn't hear anything until the housekeeper woke me with the news." James studied her carefully. "Your husband was significantly older than you." Margaret stiffened. "Are you implying something, detective?" "I'm implying that people have killed for less than a life-changing inheritance." Her face darkened. "Arthur and I had our differences, but I loved him. And for the record, I signed a prenup." James raised an eyebrow. That changed things. If she didn't stand to inherit much, what was her motive, if any? Leonard Crane, the business partner? Leonard Crane leaned forward, hands clasped, looking weary. "You think I had something to do with this?" "You tell me," James said. "Arthur was a successful businessman. Sometimes money makes people desperate." Leonard let out a heavy sigh. "Look, we had arguments. We were restructuring the company, and he was pushing me out. I was angry, sure, but murder? Number, I was home all night. My wife can confirm it." James made a note to follow up. Financial disputes could turn deadly, but was Leonard desperate enough to kill Mrs. Porter, the disgruntled housekeeper? Finally, James turned to Mrs. Porter. She stood rigidly, her wrinkled hands clasped in front of her. "You've worked for the Langleys a long time," he said. 22 years, she replied. "You liked your employer?" Her lips tightened. "Arthur Langley was difficult. He treated people like they were beneath him. No respect for anyone who wasn't in his world." "Did you resent him for that?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "Resentment isn't a crime, detective." James nodded slowly. No one had cracked yet. No alibi was airtight. But one of them was lying, and the only witness to the truth was a parrot. Detective James Holloway sat in the dimly lit study, staring at the only witness to Arthur Langley's murder, a green parrot named Charlie. The bird blinked at him, tilting its head as if amused by the attention, the phrases it had mimicked so far. "No, stop, please," and "you don't deserve this," had been chilling, but James needed more. If Charlie had overheard the crime, what else had it picked up? To better understand his feathered witness, James brought in Dr. Evelyn Carter, an animal behavior specialist. She stood beside the cage, arms crossed, studying the parrot with keen eyes. "Parrots don't just repeat words," she explained. "They mimic entire conversations, tone and all. They don't always say things at the same time they hear them. They store phrases and repeat them unpredictably." "So, if this bird heard the murder happen, it might be capable of replaying the entire thing?" James asked. "Possibly, Doctor." Carter nodded. "And if certain phrases are emotionally charged, like yelling, fear, or a strong command, they're more likely to stick." James leaned closer to the cage. "Charlie, what else did you hear?" Charlie fluffed his feathers, blinked, and stayed silent. Dr. Carter smirked. "He won't perform on demand. But if you spend time around him, he might start recalling more." James sighed. The last thing he wanted was to babysit a parrot. But if the bird truly had the key to the case, he had no choice. He had Charlie's cage moved to a quiet room in the estate, where he spent hours simply sitting nearby, waiting. Every now and then, the bird would chirp nonsense, mutter Arthur's name, or whistle a familiar tune. Then, just as James was about to call it a night, Charlie suddenly spoke again. "Not again, please." James froze. His pulse quickened. "Not again, please," Charlie repeated, his voice eerily mimicking fear. James's mind raced. Not again? What did that mean? Had Arthur been involved in something before? Another crime? Another attack? One thing was clear. Charlie wasn't just replaying a murder. He was hinting at a secret buried in Arthur Langley's past. The arrest happened quickly. The moment forensic accountants uncovered evidence of financial fraud within Arthur Langley's company, Leonard Crane was hauled into custody. Emails, bank records, and hidden offshore accounts painted a damning picture. Leonard had been embezzling money for years, and Arthur had recently discovered it. The motive was clear. Arthur was going to expose Leonard, so Leonard silenced him before he could. Case closed. At least, that's what the department thought. Detective James Holloway, however, wasn't convinced. As he sat in the estate, watching Charlie preen his feathers, that nagging doubt gnawed at him. The parrot had mimicked Arthur's last moments, the fear, the desperation. But there was one phrase that didn't fit the narrative. Not again, please. Why would Arthur say not again if he was being attacked over a financial dispute? It suggested something recurring, something deeper than a business fallout. James leaned forward, staring at Charlie. What do you mean by not again? The parrot blinked. Silence. Then, in a softer voice, almost a whisper, Charlie said something new. I'm sorry. I had to. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. That wasn't Arthur's voice. That sounded like the killer. He shot up from his seat, heart pounding. They had arrested the wrong man. Leonard Crane might have been a crook, but he wasn't a killer. Arthur Langley's murder was tied to something else, something Arthur had feared would happen again. James had just been looking in the wrong place. Detective James Holloway sat at his desk, sifting through Arthur Langley's past. Something wasn't right. The phrase, not again, please, haunted him. It implied fear of something that had happened before, something Arthur had experienced firsthand. Digging through old records, James finally found it. 22 years ago, Arthur Langley had been involved in a manslaughter case. The details were murky, buried under legal red tape and out-of-court settlements. The victim, a man named Victor Hensley, had died under suspicious circumstances, but Arthur had walked away unscathed. No trial, no jail time, just a quiet settlement with the grieving family. James clenched his jaw. Money had buried the truth. The case file described an incident at a private party. Witnesses claimed it was an accident. Victor fell down the stairs. But others whispered that Arthur had pushed him during an argument. Before anyone could press charges, the case was closed, and Victor's family was left with nothing but silence. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the old case photo of Victor Hensley. Revenge. Could someone from Victor's family have finally come for justice? Could not again, please, have been Arthur realizing the past was coming back to haunt him? A cold shiver ran through James. He needed to find Victor Hensley's family. Because if this theory was right, the real killer was still out there. James arrived at the Langley estate just after dawn, the early light casting long shadows across the grand hallway. The case had taken a dangerous turn. Arthur's past was catching up with him, and James was growing more certain that the killer wasn't some random business associate or disgruntled partner. It was someone who had been waiting for the right moment to make Arthur pay for something far darker than financial betrayal. Arthur's widow, Margaret, was pacing nervously in the sitting room when James entered. She straightened up at the sight of him, her face pale. "Detective, what is this about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I need to know more about Arthur's past," James said, his tone calm but firm. "Did he ever speak about a man named Victor Hensley?" Margaret froze, her hands tightening around her handkerchief. She swallowed hard, then shook her head. No, Detective. I don't know who that is." James narrowed his eyes. "Your husband was involved in a manslaughter case 22 years ago. A man named Victor Hensley fell to his death, and Arthur was named as the one responsible." Margaret's face went ashen. She broke off, her lips trembling as she looked away, clearly fighting to maintain composure. "You're lying," James said, his voice cold. "Arthur never told you? He never mentioned Victor or the settlement?" Margaret's eyes darted nervously to the door. I I don't know what you're talking about. James leaned in closer. Did you know about the Hensley family? Did you know they could have had a motive for murder? Before she could answer, James caught a sound, a faint whisper. We have to end this? James froze, turning toward the source of the voice. Charlie, the parrot, sat motionless in his cage, staring at him with piercing eyes. We have to end this, the bird repeated, its voice low and menacing. James's blood ran cold. That wasn't a phrase Arthur had said. It sounded like someone else, someone who knew something about the Langley family's past. He turned back to Margaret, his suspicions rising. What is this, Margaret? What are you hiding? She stood up abruptly, her eyes wild with panic. Nothing, detective. Nothing. I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but you're wrong. My husband had no enemies. There's nothing to this. But James wasn't convinced. He turned his gaze to the door where Daniel Langley had entered, his face filled with guilt and confusion. How much do you know, Daniel? James asked, his voice low. Daniel's face tightened, and for the first time, James saw something like fear in his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, detective. Did Arthur ever tell you about Victor Hensley? Did you know about the man he killed all those years ago? Daniel remained silent, but his jaw tightened. The tension in the room was palpable. Charlie's whisper rang in James's ears. We have to end this. The truth was slipping through his fingers, but he knew one thing for sure. The Langley family had been hiding something far more sinister than financial fraud, and the past wasn't done coming for them yet. James sat back, still reeling from the confrontation with the Langley family. Every conversation seemed to lead to more lies and evasions. Margaret's frantic denial, Daniel's stiff silence. Something was off. The parrot's cryptic words, though, were starting to piece together the puzzle, and now Charlie had spoken again. The drawer? Check the drawer. The words hung in the air, clear as day. James had already scoured the study, but there was something unsettlingly specific about Charlie's phrase. The drawer. Which drawer? He stood, pushing aside his thoughts, and walked over to Arthur Langley's massive mahogany desk. He examined the locked drawer, the one he hadn't dared to open yet. He hesitated. If the family was hiding something, it could be in here. It was time to find out. With a steady hand, James slid the drawer open, the wood creaking slightly in protest. Inside, there were several old manila folders, business contracts, old photographs, receipts, and other trivial documents. But one folder, tucked in the back, was slightly out of place. James pulled it out. The folder was thick and sealed with a faded red ribbon. He opened it carefully, knowing it was something important. Inside, James found an old letter, yellowed with age but still legible. The letter was typed, with only a small handwritten note at the bottom. Arthur, I know what you did. If you don't want the truth to come out, you'll do as I say. I have the evidence. You've been warned. A friend. James's heart pounded. This was it. The blackmail note. Arthur Langley had been extorted for something he thought he could bury. The note wasn't new, but it had clearly been a part of his dark past, something he had tried to keep hidden from everyone. As James read the note again, a chilling realization washed over him. The initials, a friend, were ambiguous, but something stood out in the corner of the letter. A name scrawled underneath in smaller handwriting. M.P. M.P. Who was that? James's mind raced. The only person with those initials in the house was Mrs. Porter, the housekeeper. He remembered the look on her face when he'd asked about Arthur's past, her tight-lipped expression, her reluctance to speak. She knew more than she was letting on. Suddenly, the entire room seemed to close in on him. The pieces were falling into place. Arthur's involvement in the manslaughter case, the blackmail letter, the parrot's cryptic warnings. It was all connected. Mrs. Porter had been part of the cover-up. She must have known about Victor Hensley and the truth Arthur had tried so hard to bury. James grabbed his phone and dialed the station. "I need a team to bring in Mrs. Porter," he said, his voice steady, "and tell them to search her things. We're about to uncover everything." As he hung up, he glanced at Charlie, who was now silently observing him, eyes wide and alert. The parrot had been right all along. The drawer had held the truth. The arrest of Mrs. Porter came swiftly. She didn't resist as the officers led her to the interrogation room, her face a mask of quiet resignation. James followed closely behind, his thoughts racing. He had no doubt now. Arthur Langley's dark past had finally caught up with him. As Mrs. Porter sat in the sterile room, her hands folded neatly in front of her, James couldn't help but notice the stoic calm that radiated from her. It was the same quiet, composed demeanor she had maintained throughout her time working for the Langley family. But behind those eyes, James could see the weight of years spent hiding the truth. "Mrs. Porter," James began, his voice steady, "you've been involved in this for a long time, haven't you?" She didn't answer right away, but the faintest twitch of her lip betrayed the battle she was waging within herself. "You knew about the manslaughter," James continued, "about Victor Hensley, and you knew Arthur Langley was responsible. That's why you blackmailed him, isn't it?" Mrs. Porter's gaze dropped to the table, her shoulders sagging slightly. "Yes," she whispered, the first hint of emotion breaking through. "But it wasn't about money. It was never about money." James leaned in, watching her closely. "Then why the blackmail? What was it really about?" She inhaled deeply before speaking, her voice trembling with barely contained anger. "My brother was the victim of Arthur Langley's crime. Victor was my brother. He was a good man, a kind man, and Arthur took him away." James's heart sank as the weight of her words settled over him. The truth was far more personal than he had imagined. Victor Hensley hadn't just been a man from the past. He had been family. "My brother never stood a chance. Arthur killed him in cold blood, and the authorities never even tried to get justice for him," she continued, her voice thick with grief. "They swept it all under the rug, and She paused, swallowing hard. "I spent years planning this. I couldn't let him get away with it." James's mind raced as he absorbed the magnitude of her confession. "And on the night of the murder, you finally got your revenge." Mrs. Porter nodded, her eyes welling with tears. "I confronted him that night. I was working late in the house, and he was alone in his study. I didn't mean to kill him, but when I saw him there, after all these years, all that rage, all that grief, it overtook me. I grabbed the letter opener, and in a moment of pure rage, Her voice faltered, and she placed her hands over her face as the tears began to fall. "I stabbed him, right there in his chair, just like Charlie heard." James's stomach churned. The words the parrot had repeated, "No, stop, please," had been the last moments of Victor Hensley's life. Arthur had begged for his life, just as he had begged when his own end had come. The parrot, Charlie, had witnessed both murders, and in his silence, he had been the only one to carry the weight of the past crime and the present. Mrs. Porter finally looked up, meeting James's gaze with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "I don't regret it," she said quietly. "Not any more." James sat back, his mind piecing together the final threads of this twisted story. The parrot, the blackmail, the murder. It was all connected. But there was still one lingering question. How had Charlie known? Why did the bird repeat those phrases? He asked softly, almost to himself. Mrs. Porter's eyes flickered, a hint of a knowing smile playing at her lips. "Because he heard it all. He was my only witness. He knew the truth." James stood, the weight of the case settling heavily on his shoulders. "And now, the truth is out." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Mrs. Porter to face the consequences of her actions. The silent witness, Charlie, had finally spoken, and with it, the long-buried secrets of Arthur Langley's past had been brought to light.